Welcome to today's interview at Better Communities Bradford. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Razia Jogi, a director and solicitor at Switalskis solicitors. With over 2 decades of experience in matters relating to children, domestic abuse and forced marriage, Razia has established herself as an expert in those fields. In 2009, Razia co-authored the pioneering book Forced Marriage, a Special Bulletin, the very first text specifically designed to aid legal professionals handling forced marriage cases. This groundbreaking work laid the foundation for legal approaches to forced marriage in the UK. Throughout her impressive career, Razia has supported hundreds, if not thousands, of women and children through complex family law issues. Her expertise and dedication were further acknowledged in 2020, where she became accredited to represent children under the Law Society's Children in Law panel. Today, as a key figure at Switalskis Solicitors, a firm with 11 branches across North, South and West Yorkshire, and more recently London, Razia continues to lead with passion and commitment, contributing significantly to the firm's reputation as a leading law firm in the UK. We are delighted to have Razia Jogi with us to share her insights and experiences. Razia, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell us what childcare law covers?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have?
We have time.
Okay, right. So childcare law, it falls into 2 aspects. You have private law children matters and you have public law children matters. Private law children matters deal with private arrangements for children. So if you have a couple who separate and they are unable to come to an agreement between themselves in respect of their children, then they may look to one or the other, one of the 2 parents may look to issuing proceedings at court. And if they do, it's referred to as a private law children matter.
Okay.
So it may be arrangements to deal with how much time the children should spend with one parent, whether they should live with this parent, how much time should be spent with the other parent. And then we have what's known as public law children matters. And that is when we're looking at children who are, the local authority are of the view, or it's their view, that the children have suffered or are at risk of suffering significant harm. And the local authority, as a statutory body, then look to stepping in order to remove children, potentially, from families because of risk of harm. They've suffered it or believed to be at risk of suffering harm. Okay. So the local authority become involved, look at potential removal of the children from the family home, if at all possible, placing with family members who could look after the children. If that can't be achieved, then potentially looking at foster care. So you have public law and private law, and that's a very general overview that I've given to you.
And do the 2 ever cross in the sense of if a couple can't agree on something, or if allegations are made during their separation, can it cross over into becoming a public matter?
Yes, it certainly can. There have been a number of cases where I have been involved where there's the case starts off, as you say, as a private law matter, and then something arises or emerges within the case. And quite often it's because there's so much conflict going on that the private arrangement just isn't being arrived at. And in the meantime, the children are being exposed to emotional harm, potentially. So sometimes that situation becomes so unmanageable that the children are being impacted to such a extent that a judge who is dealing with the case may take the view that it now may need to go into the public law arena. And at that stage, it's possibly, the judge can make an order for what's known as a Section 37 report. And that is an investigation where it is the local authority, a social worker will undertake an assessment to see whether the threshold for public law proceedings is met. Are these children at risk, or have they suffered significant harm? And if so, then the case can tip into a public law arena.
What role do lawyers play when protecting the children in these cases?
Well, we are there as lawyers. We know the law, so we are there to navigate through the legal system. So all cases relating to children, irrespective of it being a public law matter or a private law matter, highly emotive. When you look at private law cases, there's such significant, well, there's a huge amount of conflict between parents, between usually mother and father. So much so that these two people who once upon a time loved each other now cannot bear to be in the same room. They are incapable of coming to any arrangement in respect of their children. And the bitterness and the conflict is so bad that they are essentially asking a stranger, a judge, to come to some form of arrangement for them. So we as lawyers in a private law situation, people have this impression that we are going to go in all guns blazing, beating chests. It's almost like going to war. It's not. Most of the time, we are there to keep the temperature down. We are there to try and calm the situation and try and come to some form of resolve. But throughout the lifetime of the case, we as lawyers we are reminded of the child or the children concerned and what is in their best interest. The Children Act has a welfare checklist, and throughout all of our cases, we remind ourselves, and we are reminded by the judges or the magistrates who are dealing or who are deciding about the children or the child's welfare. So we have to be very careful. Sometimes we have to say to our clients, that isn't going to be achieved because that's contrary to the child's best interest.
And is that a requirement on the professional, on the lawyer themselves, to maintain the child's welfare in mind at all times?
It is. So in terms of private law cases, it's bringing a sense of reality. You are going to, what you are asking may not be achieved. It's also managing expectations as a lawyer. So in addition to dealing with the law, managing expectations, managing the situation, calming, soothing the temperatures, it's so important. There's nothing better than going to court and having a sensible opponent who is thinking along the same lines as you. It's not particularly helpful when you've got a battling mother or battling parents, and then for the lawyers to come in and to raise the temperatures and locking horns, so to speak. It's always better for us to be a lot calmer, and if the lawyers can calm or calm the situation, cool the temperature, whatever analogy you want to use.
So a lot of it is about de-escalation.
Yes. Judges will get very frustrated when we come in potentially sort of, throwing paraffin into sort of some flame. Okay. So there is more respect to bringing a sense of reality. And some of these cases, it is a bit of a reality check. Now, the public law arena, that's slightly different because we are dealing with cases where the local authority are saying that they want to remove children or they already have removed children. So emotions are already high. Parents are already upset, already aggrieved. You're dealing with children who have been removed. So from a lawyer's perspective, I deal with children matters. I'm on the children's panel. So I could be representing a mother or a father, or I could also be representing a child that's been removed.
Could you be representing the local authority?
And I'm not a local authority lawyer. Okay. I don't do local authority work. I must make it clear, at Switalskis, we do have a special department where we have a number of lawyers who undertake local authority work. Fine. But I myself don't. I am a parent lawyer and I represent children. So in terms of that, so it could be said that a child or a group of children have already been removed because of child protection concerns. They've been removed because their safety has been compromised or is at risk of being compromised. They are now living with an alternate family member, family friend, or potentially they're in foster care. But then you are still looking at a child protection element because these children have been removed from their primary carers. older children who are aware of the fact that they've been removed, that they'll be in significant, states of upset, of distress, of having been removed from their primary carer. Some may not even know why they've been removed, because the facts are not known to them, as it may be.
Thank you for that, Razia. Next question. How does UK law address domestic violence issues within the South Asian community, especially when children are involved? Now, I know the law is supposed to apply equally to all communities, all individuals, but what's your thoughts and what's your insights in regards to the South Asian community?
Well, you're absolutely right when you say that the law applies equally. The law is there and it applies equally, fairly. It's there for one and all. But what I can say is, over the years, I have been practicing, or I have been in the legal field since 1998. It feels quite frightening when I say that out loud. But when I look at the judiciary as it was then, and when I look at the judiciary as it is now, we have a judiciary who is much more aware. So they are much more culturally aware, they are much more culturally sensitive. I know a lot of people in the judiciary now who have become judges, whether district judges or circuit judges, in the last seven years or so. And these now judges were people who I came across as lawyers and barristers in private practice. So I have knowledge of those people dealing with cases when there were solicitors and barristers, and dealing with cases with people from the South Asian communities. So they, as practitioners in their practicing years, were dealing in West Yorkshire, dealing in Bradford, in Leeds, in our local courts, and dealing with the issues that we have with people, with women from Pakistani, Gujarati, Bengali backgrounds who had suffered domestic abuse, who had undergone years of domestic abuse and had not done anything about it. Concepts of izzat, shame, all of those things. So we have a judiciary who are much more attuned to those kinds of things. And also that there are other elements as well. So, for example, the judiciary, the courts are very mindful that not everybody speaks English. So very recently I was involved in a case, it was a forced marriage case. I was representing the young person, or the person who was being protected. This person had been granted a forced marriage order. There were 3 respondents, so 3 people who the orders had been made against. 1 was legally represented, 2 were not legally represented because they didn't qualify for legal aid. But the court made absolutely sure that there were interpreters present. Right. So there are lots of ways in which all these, I'm not saying they're not allowances, it's now an expectation. There is an expectation an interpreter will be present. And I'm also aware that the judiciary are more mindful, more aware through experience. And of course, they also have judicial training courses. So yes, I would say that the judiciary are in a good place to deal with cases and those issues, those problems that may be relevant in particular to South Asian communities.
Going back to something you said earlier, so the professionals who were once practicing and representing clients, through their experience, they've gained insights, and now they're part of the judiciary, and therefore they're able to benefit the whole system because they've had the experience of actually representing all these clients.
That is indeed correct. We now have, I would say, a judiciary who is, I'm talking about family judges here. We have a number of family judges sitting at the combined court in Bradford. And I'm talking about my experience, and we have a number of judges sitting in Leeds, Huddersfield, and these are the West Yorkshire courts. They're the ones that I frequent regularly. And of course, they're the ones that are applicable to us, and particularly Bradford. A lot of Bradford cases are also heard in Leeds. So these are judges who, as I said, were practitioners, dealt with South Asian people from, or dealt with people from the South Asian community. And there's also now a drive for people from different communities to apply for the judiciary. Once upon a time, the judiciary comprised of middle-class white men. That's what the judiciary was. Women then started entering the judiciary, and now there's an encouragement for other people from the African communities, people from Muslim communities, Pakistanis, well, when I say Muslim, of course, Pakistanis, but from all walks of life, well, when I say all walks of life, that's incorrect, but people, within the law, you don't have to be white, middle-class male to be a judge. People now are being encouraged because we are a diverse community, and the judiciary needs to be representative of that.
Okay. I think we're hopefully seeing more of a drive towards that in many a field, aren't we? And I guess the same thing applies to the judiciary, an increased representation of the communities they serve.
Indeed, I would agree with that.
Okay, something a little bit more close to home. What are some of the challenges, some of the difficulties the South Asian community faces when challenging issues like domestic abuse? And of course, there are challenges across all communities. I'm asking for your insights around some of the more specific issues that apply to the South Asian community.
Well, I have already mentioned that I have been in the legal field since 1998. I have been practicing in Bradford since 2004. When I initially started working in Bradford, all my caseload comprised of domestic matters, domestic abuse matters, and private or children matters. And I my clientele comprised largely of women, and there was a significant split. 80%, I would say, were women from the South Asian community. And these women would come in to see me, usually 8 times out of 10, with a support worker from an organisation, Women's Aid or some women's support organisation. It wasn't usual for a woman from the South Asian community to make the appointment herself. It was usually in response to an incident where the police had become involved. The police had then referred the matter to a women's support organisation, and the female, the client then concerned, then comes into the office. From that, I got a clear impression that women were reluctant to take the first step. And then when speaking to them, when hearing their stories, when hearing their backgrounds, it would be that they had been subject, their stories were they had been subject to domestic abuse for several years. And it was a neighbour that had called the police had come in, police had treated it like a domestic, police had then referred the female to a domestic abuse group. The domestic abuse group had then made the appointment, brought the client in. We then speak to when I say we, myself, colleagues, we would speak to the client, tell the client their options. And it was very disheartening at times because as a lawyer, as a woman, as a person, it was apparent that this woman, this client, needed help. And she was reluctant to receive that help, or reluctant to take the action that was being offered because of pressures, family pressure, societal pressure.
Pressure that's not as apparent or not as present in other communities, would you say, correctly?
Yes. Well, yes, I would agree with that. So if it was a female from the English community,
Yes.
she would not be so much concerned about the net effect of taking out an injunction against her violent partner.
Elaborate, please. What do you mean net effect?
If I take out an injunction, if I do what you were advising me, which is to take out an injunction, my parents are going to be very upset with the steps I take. My marriage will then break down. What will I then do? It's perfectly possible for this situation to be dealt with in another way. My family are going to talk to his family, and I've never told my family about what's been happening, and then hopefully we can address it in that way. So there was quite often a drive to resolve things through family mediation. And in my experience, matters of domestic abuse are not resolvable through family mediation.
That's a really interesting point. I remember as a police officer, one thing that we kind of determined was Asians don't tend to call the police first off, and we don't tend to leave our women, if that's the right way to say it. South Asian women historically don't tend to leave abusive marriages until the police are called.
And sometimes they go back.
I remember, going back, it's been a long time since I was in the police, but going back, most often they'd go back. And like you say, it'd be because there was a belief that family mediation would help stop the abuse. And a lot of the times, they wouldn't want to end the relationship, they'd want the abuse to end.
You've hit the nail on the head. So I'm just going to pull it back a bit. So South Asian communities, we live as a community. The thought of the police driving up, down the road, parking outside your house and knocking on your door, God forbid, because then everybody would know that something untoward is going on in your four walls. So that's one reason not to involve the police. In my experience, when the police were involved, it was usually because a neighbour had called them or a child had called them, or if a client of mine had called them, she did it in absolute panic, but had then abandoned the call halfway, and then the police had traced the number and had then attended. Again, my experience, quite often when the police attended, and you said you worked in the police force, sometimes you would take away the male person because an offence had been committed. It was obvious to see. Or if you had arrived after the event, you take away the male so that there's a cooling period.
That's correct, yeah. To prevent a breach of the peace, it was called.
Indeed.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And that then gives some thinking time. He's taken away, sometimes in handcuffs, sometimes not. And then quite often females or the woman would think, oh, well, let that be a lesson to him. I'm sure he will be very worried by that. And then by that time, family all become involved and they all say the right things, and that there may be remorse, but unfortunately, domestic violence isn't fixed in that way. That's a very short fix. I'm sorry, you were about to interject me, but please don't, because if I don't say this, I may forget. There are other ways to address domestic violence. I'm not saying that if a man is violent, he will be violent forever. Therapy, attending domestic violence perpetrators groups to understand what are my triggers, what gets me so angry, why do I behave in this way, learning other techniques in how to manage one's behaviour. Surely that's a better way of dealing with it and maintaining a healthy family life.
I think maybe 20 years ago I wouldn't have had the same opinion as yourself. However, due to the experience as a police officer or as a criminal defence advisor and now magistrate, I'm better placed to agree with you and better placed to have a broader understanding of the issues that our communities face. I think what I want, Razia, is your insight. Why doesn't family intervention work? Because it doesn't. I'd love it if it did, but it doesn't. What's your thoughts on that?
Throughout my years, I have dealt with a raft of cases. There are a few that spring to mind where, again, it's a female, has come to me, has started the legal process, has walked through the legal process, has continued with it, and then has suddenly decided, no more. I want to end the court proceedings because my family and his family have been talking, and we feel that court proceedings is making the situation worse. Whatever's happened has happened. Ultimately, we wish to reconcile for the sake of our children. Now, as a lawyer, I give advice, which is if you abandon the court proceedings, then that's it. There are no orders. It's then a matter for you. And then what would happen is 12 months, 15 months, 18 months later, the client would return again. And the usual, I don't want to use the word story, but I can't think of another one, but the usual explanation would be everything was okay for the first 3 months, and then there was deterioration. And then I spoke to my mum, who spoke to my father, who spoke to his uncle, who spoke to my husband. There was a brief improvement, and then it deteriorated again. And then I spoke to my mother, and it becomes this cycle, and then people stop speaking. There is no reporting that the situation has deteriorated because it becomes this tiresome cycle. And unless there is something more robust, and when I say more robust, I go back to things like therapy, marriage counselling, domestic violence perpetrators program, and I would also recommend women who are victims of abuse, domestic abuse, to also go on programs where they learn about what constitutes domestic abuse. Over the years, I had so many clients who would say, I would say, oh, is he violent to you? And they'd say, well, not really. And then they would describe an incident which would have something which is glaringly obvious. It's an act of violence. But they had become desensitized to it. So, raising of the voice and threatening to kill wasn't deemed as violence because he didn't touch me, but he threatened to kill you. If somebody makes a threat to kill, that's a criminal offence. Is that correct? You've worked in the police force.
If the recipient of the threat has a genuinely held belief that the threat will be carried out.
Yes. Well, I've had cases where clients did believe that they were at significant risk of harm, so they ran off upstairs and locked themselves in the bathroom and then came out 2 hours later, by which time he had gone. And then they come to see me and say, well, he just shouted and frightened me. But that, in their mind, doesn't constitute domestic abuse.
Yes, that would be a criminal offence. If you're in some danger of immediate unlawful violence, then that's an assault, whether the physical battery has occurred or not.
I bow down to your criminal knowledge.
We're a very community-driven people, aren't we? We have communities, we have large families, extended families often in our business, I'm head in theirs, and we like to handle a lot of things within the family. However, my experience, and from what I'm understanding from what you're telling me, your experience is families aren't very good at stopping domestic violence, and we need a lot more robust interventions, like you said, therapy for both parties, separately and together, legal interventions, orders, etc. What's the role of religious leaders, our religious representatives, our imams, our mosque committee members? How do you think they can contribute to tackling this issue?
These are very uncomfortable topics.
I think that's why we're discussing them.
Domestic abuse, it's an uncomfortable topic. Child abuse, it's an uncomfortable topic. And religious leaders, in my experience, really don't want to be having those uncomfortable topics. The mosques, the masjids are places where the men come, pray 5 times a day and leave, where the children come, have their religious classes and they leave. And this is my experience of mosques and masjids. And they certainly could have a more wider role. It is clear in the Quran what the view is about violence against women. Women are sacred. Violence is wrong. Violence within relationships is wrong. That's the narrative. And there needs to be, or there could be, there should be teachings at madrasa about etiquette, about behavior. Let me correct myself. At mosques, there are classes for children from the point that they start about etiquette. Yeah, what prayer you should make before you eat, what prayer you should make when you finish eating, before you go to bed, when you wake up, when you drink water. When children are then at a certain age, I think it would be beneficial for even these conversations, these lessons are had at school about self-awareness, but why can't similar conversations and lessons be had at mosque?
Why do you think they can't? Why aren't we doing that? And I'm in agreement with you here, and I don't agree with you too much. I do want to push back on some things, but I'm finding it difficult to find something we disagree on. Like you say, the masjids, the madrasas, they do a great job in teaching children how to recite the Arabic, read the Quran. There's been an increased focus on the pronunciation of the Quran and their prayers,
Which is wonderful.
But there seems to be some gap around ethics, morals, managing relationships, especially managing intimate relationships between husband and wife. Why do you think that is? What do you think has motivated or created that gap? Because historically, that's never been the case.
Historically, it hasn't, because when I went to mosque, which was about 1,000 years ago, we had Molvis, men who taught all the children, taught the boys, who taught the girls. And I imagine, having discussions with girls of, 11, 12, 13 years, it wasn't appropriate. But now in mosques, you have Abbas, you have females teaching the older girls, and you have Molvis who are teaching the older boys. So I would say it's perfectly possible for awareness classes to now be had where the Abbas are telling the girls, this is acceptable behavior, this is unacceptable behavior within the confines of Islam. Because let's draw it back, it can be linked to, it is of course linked to Islam. What is acceptable and what is not. And the same goes for discussions or lessons that can be had. So it's there, it can be had, it should be had.
Razia, how can people from the South Asian community help themselves and each other in tackling issues like domestic violence, child abuse, those hot button topics that historically we've not liked to talk about, but we are, I think, getting a little bit more conversant around them?
The first thing is recognition and acknowledgement. So again, my experience, where not so much now, but there was a time when it wasn't uncommon for South Asian people to live within extended households. So you would have a number of sons who went on to marry, and their wives would live in the same household. And when I was dealing, when I dealt with DV cases, which I still do, it wasn't uncommon for a client to say to me, my husband hit me and my sister-in-law was aware of it. Will your sister-in-law give evidence? Is she willing to give a statement? No, she won't, because that will then have an impact on her marriage. So there's this knock-on effect. Will your mother be prepared to give a statement? No, she won't, because it will upset my father. So domestic abuse happens. People may be aware of it, but there may be some reluctance to acknowledge it, to essentially call it out. Now, the situation, I would say, is now improving in the sense that there is awareness. We have organisations like Better Communities Bradford. We certainly need more. This is absolutely fabulous. It's fantastic, but not every town has a Better Communities Huddersfield or a Better Communities Dewsbury. It would be ideal to have a Better Communities in every single town, because an outlet like this is a safe space. Safe space is very important. If you have a group of women coming to an organisation like Better Communities Bradford, having that safe space, having the ability to speak, the number of cases I dealt with where women from the South Asian community didn't divulge, didn't talk about what they had been going through until something had happened. So, for example, they had gone to school to drop off, to do a school run with a black eye. And the child had said something along the lines of, last night Daddy shouted at Mum and hit her. And then that forces a conversation. These conversations relating to domestic abuse, disclosures shouldn't be forced. They should happen. They should occur naturally. They should occur organically. Our women need to be, when I say our women, by that I mean women from the South Asian community, need to be given the courage, which they don't have. They need to be encouraged. They don't have the courage themselves. They need to be encouraged to step forward and to say, this has happened.
I'm going to ask you to draw a distinction and give me your thoughts on this distinction. When you say they don't have the courage and they need the encouragement, is it the same for British-born South Asian women or British-born women of South Asian heritage as it is for immigrant women from South Asia?
To some extent. So the stories that I have through my experience, those women who have come from, and I'm talking about my clientele, the women that had come over from, say, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, their struggles were more prominent. And that was due to having potentially no family in this country, no own family in this country. They had come as brides. No awareness of the language, of the British way of life, so to speak, and then coming here as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, and then becomes a mother and is then a homemaker. So for those women, of course, in my experience, it was a lot more difficult. But having said that, it is still difficult for women from the South Asian community, even if somebody who has been born and raised, grown up in the UK, yes, they have the language, they have the awareness, they have the know-how. I can speak to my doctor, I can call 999. But it's still, because of the wider conversation that's not had, which is domestic abuse is wrong. It is okay for you to walk away from your husband. It is okay for you to call the police to report your husband as being a perpetrator of domestic abuse. I think that needs to be reinforced a little bit more, or should I say, a lot more. It is okay.
We've spoken a lot about South Asian women. In your experience, what's the, I don't want to ask percentage, but what's the prominence of men in the South Asian community suffering from domestic abuse? Whether it's coercive controlling behaviour, whether it's acts of violence, do you get many coming to you for help?
I cannot give you any statistic whatsoever.
Just your experience then.
And my experience is massively limited, because throughout my time as a lawyer in Bradford dealing with domestic abuse work, I attracted female clientele. And throughout my time in 21, all the years that I practice in Bradford, I believe I've, to the best of my recollection, have represented 2 men. That is not to say men are not the victims of domestic abuse, but I have represented more female clientele than, much more female clientele than male clientele.
Do you find that by the time a case has come to you or to the police, it's not an isolated incident? There's been a pattern of abuse before the authorities have become involved or before lawyers have become involved?
Absolutely.
Say more, please.
So within a private, I do less injunction work now than I did previously, because since 2020, I have been practicing more so in public law children proceedings. But prior to 2020, I did extensive work relating to domestic abuse, extensive. And the majority of my cases were ladies who had come to me, first timers. I'd never seen them before. They had never seen a solicitor before. And when I did domestic violence work, my first question would be, can you tell me about the very first incident of domestic abuse that you were subjected to? And that, the response to that would take us back several years before. I would then ask, what was the worst incident of domestic abuse? And then, when was the last incident of domestic abuse? And it was usually the last incident which had triggered the attendance. So it was very unrare, or it was very, yes, it wasn't the norm for a client who had come to see me to seek an injunction who had one isolated incident of domestic abuse. There was a catalogue, a culminative effect, which had resulted in the appointment.
I'll agree with that. During my time as a police officer, I never saw, especially from the South Asian community, a lady step forward and say, I'm a victim of domestic abuse after a single isolated incident. It'd always been a lengthy catalogue of abuse, sometimes quite serious, before they got the police involved or got the authorities involved.
What I also found was, when we talked about, and for me it was very important to get a rounded picture. And the first question, or one of the first questions being, can you tell me about the first time you were subjected to violence? And I would be told of the incident is in much detail as could be remembered. And then I would say, and then what happened after? And it was, well, he was very sorry. He apologized. He cried. He promised it wouldn't happen again. And that was the usual answer. And I hoped that he was telling the truth. He was very sorry, and I believed him. And that was what I was usually faced with. That is what I usually got by way of response.
In your experience, did that ever come true where a lady's come to the authorities or to the solicitors and asked for support, withdrawn her complaints ultimately, and then the violence has stopped? Do they ever stop, serial abusers?
I don't know, because they will never have, I don't know whether it has or it hasn't stopped. Because if the only way I know it hasn't stopped is because they have come back to me, or maybe they haven't come back to me, they've gone to another solicitor, and coincidentally I've seen them at court with another solicitor. And when you see, or when I see a client at court, whether it's if it was a client that I'd advised in previous years, then the assumption is something's gone awry. And my advice was always, if a client opted to withdraw her case, those are her instructions. I cannot force her to continue. I have to work in accordance with what I am being instructed with. But I would always say, if this doesn't work out in the way that you hope, then I am here. I am not here to judge you. I am not here to say to you, I told you so. You come back and we will pick up.
It used to be the case, so I remember coming across several cases where the CPS would refuse to prosecute if a woman had initiated proceedings a few times and then withdrawn them a few times. And ultimately, the CPS would refuse to proceed after, let's say, the 7th or the 8th prosecution or the allegation. Is that still the case? Does that still happen?
Now, I have had a number of experiences where the prosecution have proceeded regardless, and the prosecution have also suggested that the complainant who has withdrawn her complaint for the 4th or the 5th time, there will be consequences for her. Now, I certainly had that in one particular case.
What's the thinking behind that? How does that serve justice? How do CPS make their case for doing that?
I'm not a criminal lawyer. I cannot say.
Okay, finally, are things getting better or worse? Is domestic violence increasing? Is it pretty much the same, or do you think it's reducing amongst the South Asian community?
Unfortunately, I can't give you a definitive response to that question. I don't have the statistics, but what I can say is that as we have gone through the years, there is more recognition of domestic abuse. There is a better and more had conversation about domestic abuse in South Asian communities. We have organisations like this, and through organisations like this, there is awareness. This is a conversation. Two people who originate from the South Asian community having this conversation. And more of this needs to be out there so that there is knowledge, there is awareness, and it will educate and encourage.
Thank you. That's been great. Razia, thank you for attending. Thank you for supporting us. And we hope to do this again with you soon enough.
Thank you for inviting me, and my absolute pleasure.
You're very welcome. Thank you.